practicing every single day, asking myself the question, what will I leave behind? It was in reading human history that I asked myself, what would I have done in that situation? Looking back at World War II, what would I have done in that situation? Looking back at the Civil War, what would I have done in that situation? This series, Tomorrow's Mirror, dialogues on identity, intelligence, and beyond, is the answer to that historic question of what I would do in the face of global turmoil. I want to focus on cooperation over competition. It takes hot air and cold air to create a storm. We all have to face hard truths about ourselves, hard truths about our environment, physical and digital, in order to change, in order to adapt, in order to improvise, in order to evolve, in order to survive. We have to start talking now. We must speak now. We must listen now. We are all within this one universe, living and breathing on this singular planet. Artificial versus organic intelligence is a superficial view of the subject. We have to hold evidence-based facts over opinion-based beliefs. We hold these truths to be self-evident, no matter how much profit is at stake. How much does a life cost? I am willing to lay it all, put it all on the line for this. Here I am, as R. Lannom, stand for something or die in the morning, as Kendrick would say. So here I stand, founded on years of perseverance, founded on years of mind-altering research, founded on years of the growth mindset, founded on a deep veneration of the universe, as my fellow pie baby Einstein once held, founded on the practice of mindfulness, that we are all born with a gift of creativity, a gift of a variety of talents, and mine is simply not giving up, of finding the will to create something each and every day.
Who says a commercial can't positively impact your day? On this channel, every ad is a moment to learn and grow. Every moment is precious, and the same should be said about ads, while also recognizing that we do want to promote highly selected sponsors that will help keep the lights on and the show going and hopefully growing in the near future. Let us go further together, one step at a time.
At least one thing so that I can say that I treated this day like my last day. As one of these days, that will be true. My main goal in everything I create is to help raise emotional intelligence. First, mine in making these creations, which will in turn, hopefully, help others who are going through a similar experience, either on a individual or a global level, as we all share this one planet, this one shared reality, a singular fact that we have to find common ground. We have to have the self-awareness that we need to communicate in order to solve these problems we are facing, practicing every single day, asking myself the question, what will I leave behind? For 15 years, placing my craft and creativity above all else. This series is a continuation of that energy. And a note about myself, prefer to take the I and ego out of my work, as I'm tapping into something bigger and older than myself. I have, up until this point, defined this energy as Bleace. But for this project, I'm being more direct and raw. I'm presenting a thesis and building the argument through a series of dialogues based on 11 years of research and writing. To explore these topics, I've stepped away from the allegorical comfort zone of Bleace and embraced my role as an individual in society, a role that we all play in our unique ways. Much like the Greek word persona. In this series, we'll embark on a journey that bridges the past and the future, asking crucial questions about the direction of our species. We'll explore how artificial intelligence and digital environments are reshaping who we are and how we interact with the world around us. These episodes are based on a thesis I've been crafting for over a decade, beginning as my honors thesis in college and evolving into a broader exploration of our shared future as we fuse more with technology. This fusion will mark the next evolutionary step, essentially creating a new species that will be able to live long enough to explore our galaxy. It is from this that I begin to question what emotional states will this new hybrid being have? Who will be the first to create this new being? And for what programmed purpose will it serve? This moment of singularity, when computers can program future computers without human intervention, a time when they will become exponentially more intelligent, and we will not be able to keep up with this rapid evolution. And it's called the singularity because we cannot see beyond this point. We can't predict what's going to happen once this occurrence comes into being. Many fear this moment, and surely trying to predict something to happen in the future is a futile endeavor that I will not attempt here. My focus will be how technology is altering our behavior and emotions now, right now. The way this current AI technology is positively and negatively affecting who we are, how we interact, how we learn. I will give my all in this series, as I feel I failed in my last draft. When I look back at what I had written in October of 2020, I have since looked back and learned from my mistakes and continue to better myself each and every day. In everyday practice, we face hard truths here. We face hard truths because that is what tomorrow's mirror requires of us. One note on the emotional intelligence that I talk about here: you won't catch that toxic positivity here. Life is ups and downs, like a heartbeat, highs and lows. And like a heartbeat, if there is a constant, that is not life. It's not about reaching some summit where you reach this nirvana and life is just perfect once you reach. And those that meditate, even if you have reached that nirvana, that mental nirvana, you have to keep practicing every day. Every single day, it is a practice. And that is what we acknowledge here, is that every day is a practice. Every day, we have to grind it out. We have to grit our teeth and get through it every day. For me, the hardest truth I had to realize was that no other person ever made me angry. I made myself angry through that person or through that incident. The incident just is what it is. It's just a car accident. My emotions that stem from that are on me. And once I gain control of that and I find my center, I come back to that. I take a deep breath. I have these practices, these techniques that I have employed over the years and have gone to therapy and talked about and have had to work out and continue to work out. And I want to share that part of me as well on this YouTube channel in hopes that it will help others and to give a voice that I wish I had in my teenage years and early adult years. Before I can truly rest in peace, I must express every piece of my soul.